Hey guys, welcome to my weapon tier list for Gunfire Reborn. If you're like me and stumbled across this super addicting roguelike game, then you've probably also noticed how many weapons are in this game. So for this tier list, I'm going to be breaking it down into weapon categories and go through each weapon and where it sits on the tier list. So to start off with, we're going to just start with the rifles. And for the first rifle, we have the Big Hippo, which I have at tier E. I just don't really like this weapon too much because it normally doesn't come with elemental damage on it. And the damage is kind of low compared to other weapons in the same class. The benefit is that it has a huge magazine on it. The Cavalry is a pretty good weapon and I have it at tier C just because it has pretty good damage and it's reliable with pretty good range as well. And if you're lucky enough to get it with like elemental damage and you combine it with the cat character, you can get some pretty crazy results. The Crimson Fire Scale, I have it at S tier just because it's got a really good rate of fire. Its second ability is amazing that shoots out a bunch of fireballs and you get access to that secondary every time you get a crit hit. And it always comes with fire damage and its magazine size and reload speed is really good. This thing can absolutely carry you through a run from the first room all the way to the end. For the Dragon Chaser, I have it at tier A. This weapon's really good for boss fights because of the ability to consistently hit weak points because it has like that tracker dart on it. And if you're also really lucky to get it with elemental or +3 projectile, this thing can absolutely rip. Overall, I think it's really good, not S tier level, but I just couldn't place it in B or anything lower just because of how consistently you can get hits with it. For the Lightning Blast, I have this at tier D. I don't really like this weapon too much. I used to like it. I just find that setting up that little circle thing that increases your damage is pretty annoying. And the DPS is kind of below average, same with the rate of fire. So I don't really see a use for this weapon over others. So yeah, I think tier D is appropriate for this weapon. And for the final rifle, we have the Rainbow Arch. I think this thing's actually pretty underrated just because it doesn't really come with elemental normally, but its secondary ability is also pretty good. It's like a grenade launcher that's like really high velocity and it just increases your DPS that tiny bit. It's pretty much like a better version of the Dragon Chaser, like a higher fire rate, but you do need to hit your shots with it. So up next, we have the pistol class. And for starters, we have the Aura of Venom at tier F. I don't really like this weapon just because it's got a small magazine and it makes it suffer like DPS wise because you're constantly having to reload. It's got pretty decent, surprisingly damage per shot, but just that fire rate's so slow. The Foundry, of course, everybody knows this weapon. I have it at C tier just because it scales in damage as you play and progress through stages. So I think it's a nice sweet spot for this weapon. The Glimmering, I have it at tier A just because it's got pretty good damage, pretty good velocity. It builds really well with fire builds and just has overall good DPS. That's all I got pretty much to say about it. And with the Prism, it's pretty similar to the Glimmering, just depending on if you have a corrosive build going or if you have a fire build. And when you miss with the Prism, it starts to bounce off the wall and it really increases your damage, especially in like the first stage because it's all enclosed inside of like tiny rooms. Prism's been pretty much god tier since like the first few patches and it's still pretty good to this day. Scorching Rounds I have at tier E. I found that the damage was below average, kind of a smallish magazine size, though it does have a really good reload rate. I just don't think this weapon really does anything really well or exceptional. So I think E tier is going to be a pretty good spot for this weapon. For the Sunder, I have it at F tier because every time I see this weapon, I never really want to pick it up, even when I just have like a Foundry on me. It doesn't really do anything well over any of the other weapons, and I just don't see any use for picking this thing up when you have 49 other weapons in the game. For the Talisman, I have it at tier B. This thing packs a large magazine. It hits weak points for you, comes with all 3 elemental damages. It does above average damage, not the best, but pretty good. So yeah, this is definitely a good pickup if you do see it in one of your runs. The Thunderstorm, I have it at tier E. I almost put this at tier F, but tier F is literally useless weapons. This thing has a little bit of usability behind it, but it does suffer from really slow fire rate, and its secondary ability isn't even that great, which has like this explosive effect, and it's got such a small magazine. Like I personally think they should just increase the fire rate on this weapon because it's pretty useless as it stands. For the next category weapons, we have the Launcher class. The Bone Dragon I have at B tier. This thing's actually a really good support weapon because it's one of the few weapons that actually provides CC, like crowd control, because it sucks people into like the black hole and actually does a surprisingly high amount of damage. So I think this thing's actually pretty underrated. The Justice I have at tier C, this thing does decent damage, the range is below average, and the pro is that it usually comes with fire damage, and it is a really cool looking weapon, but I mean, that doesn't really put it higher on the list, so I think tier C is a pretty good sweet spot for this. For the Shrieker, we have it at tier F. I honestly think you should avoid this thing at all costs. It shoots way too slow and does way too little damage to even have as a secondary weapon you might even use once in a while. Just avoid this thing, guys. The Tiger Cannon I have at D tier. I almost put this at B or C tier, but I just find it relies so heavily on opulent scrolls and certain ascensions to make it really viable to really have it any higher on the list than C. Though I do think it does really well if you have the proper build for it. For the next category of weapons, we have the shotguns, which contain one of my favorite weapons, so let's get straight into it. For starters, we have the Argus, which I have it at F tier. I actually hate this weapon. I don't see any use for anybody to pick it up. Its DPS is very low. It doesn't really do anything unique over other weapons. I just think you should avoid this thing. Up next, we have the Hell, which I have at E tier. I know a lot of players like to use this weapon and it can work with certain builds, but I think overall, it requires too many scrolls to really make it viable. It does do good damage, but having to constantly reload all the time, it's really annoying. So I just have it at E tier. For the Illusion, I have it at C tier. This thing does decent damage and it is full auto, so how it works is as you shoot, it continues to fire faster the longer you shoot. It does really good for early game in my opinion, and the con with it is it usually doesn't come with elementals, so you have to find one usually later on to get that, but I do think this is actually a very good weapon. It's pretty underrated. It's pretty much like an AA-12 but Gunfire edition. For the Porcupine, I have it at tier B. This thing shoots super fast, it has above average DPS, comes with corrosive damage. This thing's really good. I just don't find it sits anywhere higher than B tier, but it still performs really well because B tier is still a really good class of weapon to use. So I'd highly recommend picking this up if you see it in your runs. The Pupil I have at S tier. This thing is absolutely amazing. It's got extremely high damage, very good mag size, and very good range. And it's got a lot of pellets as well. So every time you fire, I think it's something like 16 or 17 pellets. And if you find one in the first room, you could pretty much finish the game with one. And it comes with lightning damage, so all you cap players, if you get that lightning damage plus 120% with this thing, it can absolutely melt bosses, and I'm honestly not even afraid to say that this is the best gun in the game, bar none. The Wild Hunt I have at F tier. This thing only comes with 2 rounds in the magazine. Its damage is actually pretty good, and I've even heard some players say it's one of the highest DPS guns in the game, but it really suffers from that magazine size. So you're really forced to finding certain scrolls that refill your magazine. For example, like one of the scrolls that can fill your magazine every time you dash. But that's also why I have it so low on the list. It just requires so many things to make it work in a run. Up next, we have one of my favorite classes of weapons, which is the submachine guns. For starters, we have the Angelic Aura, which I have at tier C. This thing's got kind of average damage, but what I do like about it is its single fire ability, which pretty much just shoots 9 bullets in burst fire mode at super high rate of fire. This thing is pretty decent. It's just not that great, and when you have others in the same class that outperform it, there's really no use of picking it. The concealed ammo I have at tier B. This thing's a pretty good weapon. I mostly like it for its secondary ability, which has this explosive effect whenever you reload, kind of similar to some of the Borderlands weapons you might see. And the ammo does go pretty quick on this thing, but the rate of fire is also very high. And I don't really play the dog character, but I've heard a lot of success with players using it on that character. Up next, we have one of the hardest weapons to probably acquire in the game, just because it requires, I believe, 60 kills on the lobsters, which only spawn in the 3rd stage. But this thing is absolutely god tier. Every hit on a weak spot with this weapon increases weapon damage by 10% and can stack up to 990%. The damage is well above average. The rate of fire is well above average. This thing is absolutely god mode, and it normally comes with fire elemental damage, so if you have the cat character, you can put that all the way up to 120% and absolutely destroy. The Dual Fang, I have it at tier B. This weapon's pretty good since it cycles between fire damage and corrosive. It's got a really large magazine to it, pretty good overall, and its crit X and crit procs are kind of unreliable due to the wave pattern of the projectiles, but overall its DPS is still really good and well above most of the other weapons in the game, so this is actually pretty high on my list. For the scalpel, I have this at also S tier because it's got super good DPS, and if you have it on double shot, that increases it so much more. And it's got really good velocity and range as well. And if you can find an elemental variant on the scalpel with like a large magazine or anything that instantly reloads your magazine, will really help your build with the scalpel, as it kind of likes to eat through ammo pretty quick. But if you have the aim, this thing will absolutely do the work for you. The Star Devourer, I have it at tier B. This thing does really good damage. It always comes with lightning damage as well, but the downside I find with it is its recharge rate, which you have to wait once the magazine gets lower, wait for it to increase like a recharge rate. It really suffers without any kind of magazine inscriptions or scrolls with like magazine buffs, but if you do get those, it's an exceptional weapon, but I just have to put it at B tier because of that. For the next category of weapons, we have the snipers. The Bloody Drill I have at tier D. This thing does below average damage in my opinion. It's also pretty slow firing, and it's got low velocity, so it makes it hard to hit stuff at long range, which you don't really want in a sniper. And I just find the other snipers are so much better than this thing that there's literally no use on picking it up. The Double Caliber I have at B tier. This thing's got good fire rate. It shoots 2 bullets for 1 shot. And it's just got overall good DPS, really good reload, and honestly, if you have like a fire build going with it, it's really good damage. I honestly just think this is a pretty well-rounded sniper rifle to pick up. For the Golden Bow, I have this at S tier. This thing has really good damage, really good rate of fire, and it honestly works with a lot of builds, so it doesn't really matter which character you pick, this thing will probably perform pretty well regardless. And it's extremely deadly if you have it comboed with a crit X build. But the downside is it really relies heavily on good aim, so if you're not that great of an aimer, this thing might be pretty challenging to use or to do consistent DPS with. The Ghost Hawk I have at tier E. I don't really like this weapon. I used to before they kind of messed around with it. I just find it fires way too slow and reloads way too slow. The damage is actually pretty good per shot, but it just takes so long to fire. I just can't really recommend this gun. For the Piercing Flame, I have this at tier B. This thing does pretty good damage. It's got really good crit X, and it always comes with fire damage, so once again, really good with those cat character builds or certain scrolls. I think it's overall pretty well-rounded guns, so I think it sits pretty good at tier B. The Strike Wing, I have it at tier S. This thing is pretty similar to the Golden Bow. It does shoot a little bit slower, but the cool thing with it is once it impacts an enemy, it scatters and it hits other enemies' crit points. And it's got very good damage, really good crit X. So overall, this thing is absolutely amazing, especially if you can get this with some kind of elemental damage on it. The Woodpecker we have at tier D. The damage is okay, it just doesn't have that much ammo in the magazine, and constantly having to reload and shoot to click is really annoying since it's semi-auto, so your finger's probably gonna hurt after a full run of using this weapon. It eats through ammo since it uses special ammo, so I think that's only like 140 rounds of ammunition that you get. So yeah, I'd only pick this up if you have to, or you have to increase your DPS temporarily. For the final category of weapons, we have the melee weapons. The Fire Tower I have at tier A. I have this higher on the list than the other melee weapons just because it does really good base damage, and it also has a secondary ability that allows you to reach out further. It does this by like shooting out like this like wall of fire kind of thing, but it can only hit one enemy, but it still does way more damage than the other swords in my opinion. The Flowing Light I have at tier C. This thing does good damage, and it also comes with lightning damage. The downside is you have to be pretty close to do that damage, so at like Recarnation level 7, you start running into problems where you're taking so much damage just because you have to be so close to attack enemies, but it's still a really good weapon at other difficulties. The Poisonous Ghost I also have at tier C. This thing doesn't really do anything particularly different than the other swords, other than the fact that it has like a heavy second attack. It's okay, but it doesn't really increase the performance as much as you would, so I'd like to see the devs actually changing that a bit. But other than that, it's pretty much like a corrosive sword build, so if you have a corrosive build going, absolutely pick it up. So yeah guys, that's my Gunfire S to F weapons tier list. If you guys disagree with any of the weapons, just let me know in the comments, and I'll probably have like an updated one in the future because they're probably going to keep updating this game with weapons and scrolls and all that. And I might even do a tier list for other things such as the characters and the ascensions even for those characters. So yeah, just let me know in the comments if you guys are interested in seeing that kind of content. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day.